When we talk about military history, one name usually sits alone at the very top. Across a brutal, decade-long campaign, the Macedonian army marched out of Greece, swallowed Egypt, conquered Persia, and absorbed millions of square miles of territory into a single empire. Taking the throne at barely 19, Alexander the Great broke the psychological will of rival nations before his infantry even drew their swords. But that relentless eastward momentum slammed into a wall at the borders of the Indian subcontinent. The man standing in his way was King Porus. Traditional historical accounts frequently record their encounter as another classic victory for the Greek king, but looking closely at the primary texts reveals a very different reality. Did Alexander actually defeat King Porus, or did Western records quietly rebrand a massive, grinding stalemate? To find out, we have to strip away the mythology and look at the raw battlefield tactics that finally jammed the gears of the Macedonian war machine. By the time the Greek army approached India, they had already dismantled the entire Persian Empire. The Persian king, Darius, had actually begged King Porus for military backup, but Alexander crushed the Persian forces before that help could ever arrive. As Alexander crossed into Indian territory, local leaders capitulated immediately. King Ambi of Taxila welcomed the Greeks with open arms, voluntarily reinforcing Alexander's army with thousands of fresh soldiers and 5,000 elephants. Assuming the rest of the region would fold, Alexander sent an envoy demanding that King Porus submit and pay tribute. Porus refused outright and mobilized his forces instead. Between these two massive armies lay the Jhelum River. Swollen by intense monsoon rains, the fast-moving water created a treacherous natural moat. The Greeks were stuck on the western bank, while Porus entrenched his defensive line on the east. For the first time in his campaign, pure intimidation failed Alexander. He faced the logistical nightmare of a full-scale river assault against a disciplined Indian army that refused to retreat. Alexander knew a direct amphibious assault across the main ford was suicide. Instead, he moved a detachment of his troops upriver under the cover of night, using a massive rainstorm to mask the sound of their crossing. Once on the eastern bank, the Greeks were intercepted by a small vanguard led by Porus's own son. Alexander's highly experienced forces routed them easily, securing a foothold for the rest of his troops. What followed was a highly structured clash. According to the strict rules of engagement agreed upon for this specific encounter, the fighting was confined entirely to daylight hours, from sunrise to sunset. As the sun came up and the main battle commenced, Porus deployed his primary shock troops. He marched dozens of massive, armored war elephants directly into the center of the battlefield. Alexander's infantry had never faced a weapon like this. The sheer size and violence of the animals shattered the tight, disciplined formations of the Greek phalanx, causing mass panic as soldiers were trampled and tossed aside. Realizing his front line was collapsing, Alexander issued a desperate order. He commanded his specialized units to rush in with flaming torches and throw their spears directly at the elephants' eyes. The counter tactic worked, but it unleashed absolute chaos. Blinded and terrified by the fire, the massive animals spun completely out of control, tearing backward through their own lines and crushing Porus's infantry. The battlefield conditions then deteriorated further. The heavy rain from the night before had turned the ground into a thick sludge. Porus's heavy chariots, which were designed for rapid flanking maneuvers, sank deep into the mud and became completely useless. What began as a highly calculated tactical maneuver dissolved into a grueling, mud-soaked slaughter. Nature and sheer panic stripped away the complex strategies, leaving both sides fighting a desperate war of attrition. After nearly 8 straight hours of hand-to-hand combat, the casualties on both sides were staggering. Exhausted and bleeding, Alexander finally sent messengers across the field to request a halt to the fighting. A mutual ally eventually convinced Porus to listen. The two leaders agreed to a diplomatic truce. Porus retained his kingdom and his title, turning what should have been an imperial conquest into a bitter tactical stalemate. The cost of this battle cut deep into Alexander personally. He lost thousands of his best veterans and his famous, lifelong warhorse, Bucephalus, sustained fatal injuries and died shortly after the fighting stopped. The psychological trauma of the Hydaspes River broke the spirit of the Greek army. Terrified of facing more war elephants and endless Indian kingdoms, his men mutinied. They refused to march another step eastward, forcing a massive retreat that eventually ended with Alexander's premature death in the distant city of Babylon. Alexander may have technically held the field at the end of the day, allowing Western records to claim a victory, but the tactical reality shows that Porus's resistance ended the Greek advance into India, forcing Alexander to turn his army back toward the west.